Kia ora, Tato. Good evening, everyone. Now, mai haere mai, and welcome to our Facebook live chat this evening. Um, Tonight, we will have a chat on how do I go about giving them the allergen foods for our tamariki. My name is Roslyn. I am a Plunkett line nurse working for Plunkett, and I am here tonight with our very lovely Helen Norrish. She's a pediatric dietitian to Whatu Ora Nelson Marlborough. I'll give you the floor, Helen. You introduce yourself. Good evening.
Kia ora, everyone. Thank you, Rosalind. Yes, I'm a paediatric dietitian here in Nelson, and I've been working with children, infants, and the whanau for 22 years in Nelson here.
Cool.
And yeah, so really love it. And so just here to share some information and some practical tips for our so that our whānau know how to go about introducing these allergen foods.
Yeah. Okay, that's cool. And thanks for joining us for tonight, Helen. Um, Now, I think the question, of course, like how do I go about giving allergen foods to our pepi, to our tamariki? Um, and we assume that this would be at what age, Helen? Like, are we looking at 6 months onwards, or what's the guidelines on this? Walk us through
Yeah,
around
so
that.
the guidelines is around the 6 months of age when you're introducing solids. So just a reminder, the allergen foods, there's the egg, peanut,
Hmm.
cow's milk, wheat, soy, sesame, tree nuts, fish,
Hmm.
and shellfish. So they are what we call the allergen foods. And of course, when we start to
Mm.
introduce first foods for our infants, we look for the signs that they're ready for having those first foods. And then of course, because you're not necessarily these aren't going to be the first ones. You usually
Mm.
introduce some vegetable, maybe some meat, and
That's right.
and maybe a bit of baby rice, something like that, and
Mm.
then you will start introducing some of these other egg or peanut and
That's right.
things like that. Hmm.
Yeah. And of course, ideally, you wouldn't introduce those food allergens the first time. Um, so they would have, probably started with some other, like very plain foods as well, Helen. And
That's right.
yeah,
Hmm.
yeah.
Hmm.
And those are the allergen types of foods. And by the way, if you have just jumped online or if you have got any questions to any of us, you can either type in your comments in the comment section down below, or you can always give Blanket Line a call as well anytime, 0800 933 922 for any questions that you might have got there. Um, Okay, and so Helen, do you think like how much to start with and suggestions on how to start this
Yeah,
with
yeah.
allergens? Mm,
So, generally, what we say is that just a small amount.
mm,
Um, so maybe like just a quarter of a teaspoon, and then
mhm,
if the infant seems fine, then move up to next time half a teaspoon, and
mm,
then just gradually increase the amount. So, say for example, you're going to introduce some well cooked egg and your infant is, say, 7 months, they've started with a little bit of mashed texture in their solids,
mm,
you would well cook the egg, mash it up, and then take out, so it might be a boiled egg and you've mashed it, and you take out a quarter of a teaspoon and add it with what you're going to be giving them.
mm, mm.
Um, so I guess one of the key things we're saying about when to introduce these allergen foods, perhaps if I just go back in time, we used to say
Mm.
to avoid introducing these allergen foods till after they're one, when they're sort of some things we used to avoid. We used to tell parents not to introduce like fish till they're a lot older and things like that. But
Mm.
now the evidence is showing us that if we delay introducing these allergen foods, particularly the egg and peanut, then they're more likely to develop an allergy. So if we can get it in
Mm.
before they're 12 months of age, then this is helping to prevent them developing an allergy. And this is what the research is now telling us to
That's
do.
right. Yeah, yeah. Because I remember probably back in those olden days, they wouldn't even dare introduce any food allergens because they're too scared that, their tamariki is gonna react to it at some point, isn't it? But it's good that
Right.
these are now backed up with good research. So,
Mm,
parents are also now well informed of their choices and options for their pepi
yeah.
and tamariki who have been being introduced with food allergens. Um, Now, what would we suggest, Helen, to our viewers or to our whanau on what foods and for what sort of stages of development we're going to be introducing or offering?
Right. So, for example, for peanut,
Mm-hmm.
we obviously we're not going to give them whole nuts,
Mm.
but smooth peanut
Mm.
butter is what you would use, and you would use that
Right.
right through, even as toddlers, you're
Mm.
wanting to use the spreads rather than whole nuts. And so and that's the form for that. And something like egg, as I talked about, early stage, it might be mashed. If
Mm.
they're depending on when you're introducing it, it could be a little bit of scrambled egg.
Mm.
So yeah, so that's so some of the other, so for example, the for the dairy product one, the cow's milk, it might be in the form of a little bit of grated cheese on
Mm.
something, just one strand of grated cheese, when they actually, especially if they're picking things up in their fingers,
Oh.
or it might be a little bit of yogurt,
Mm.
that sort of thing. And I guess things like wheat, you
Mm-hmm.
might, when they're around about, when they're having a little bit more of mash, 7 to 8 months, you might introduce some wet bix,
Mm.
and that's or some pasta. So,
Oh.
again, mashed up if they're having mashed foods. So they're the ways. And then when they're starting to have finger foods, of course, they can have the bread.
Yeah.
And so if one question that sometimes comes up is,
Mm.
what about if we never have some foods? Like, for example, we never have shellfish in the house. Do I have to
Mm. Mm.
introduce shellfish to my infant? And so, usually, if they never have shellfish in the house, then it's actually um, probably not a good idea to just give it once and then never give it
Mm.
again,
Mm.
because they may develop, if they have it further down the track. Just because you've introduced it once, there is a slight chance that they could develop the
Mm.
allergy the second time. So if if you never have seafood in the house, it's not part of your
Mm.
every sort of food, then it doesn't necessarily have to be introduced. And the same with some of the tree
Right.
nuts. Some families just don't have, cashews or Brazils or,
Mm.
hazelnuts or some of the other tree nuts, and they never have them as part of their everyday eating. And
That's
so
right.
wouldn't be the ones that they would have to introduce. But the other ones that we have that are in foods and things like our egg and our peanut and our cow's milk, soy is in breads, soy flour. So if wanting to introduce soy in the early stages, you can use something like tofu. Some might use mashed tofu. For sesame, some might use tahini, which is it's a sesame, and it can be spread on something or just a little tiny bit added, like the quarter of a teaspoon added into the food.
Toast.
So the site that we talked about, there's a very good website called NIP, Allergies in the Bub, and it comes up. I think we've got it up somewhere. Oh, there you are. And that's got some great tips and even some recipes and some ways of introducing these different allergen foods. So certainly would recommend our whanau to go and have a look at that site if they're wanting to look at more some more tips on
great
how to do that.
Perfect. So the NIP allergies in the bub is, if you Google search that, this website would come up, the preventallergies.org.au. And thanks for sharing that to us, Helen. And when it comes to, I think, like the practical tips on introducing allergen foods to bubs, so that's really quite handy. How are we going to sort of introduce these allergen foods in a practical way? You've probably touched some of it, like when you've said making sure that the family eats this food, and if not, like say the shellfish, not really necessarily that they would eat it. Or there might be some families that have got say for example, parents, mom and dad has got allergies to something. Would it be necessary that the babies or their tamariki would be allergic to their allergies as well, or most unlikely?
I mean, there is a slight increased risk that they may also develop have the same allergy, but not always. And so what we recommend is that we still need to introduce the allergen food. So if, say, mum's got a peanut allergy and she doesn't want to be the one exposing, she's at risk herself if she's quite is quite sensitive to the peanuts. So it might be that another member of the family would come along and do that for her, or maybe the father can, the dad can come do the introduction. So it's keeping the other person who's got the allergy in the family safe. So say it's a sibling that's got an allergy, there are ways that you can go about that. So the key thing would be perhaps either making sure that you are introducing the allergen food. Maybe it might be that the sibling is at maybe at preschool or kindy or something, or making sure that the infant that you're introducing the allergen food to is perhaps sitting in a high chair, so that trying to and keeping an eye on that the food isn't being shared with the other sibling. Making sure that there's no cross contamination, so that say you're giving them,
very important.
So the sibling maybe got a peanut allergy, that you use a different knife, you wash the knife and then put it aside so that there's no contamination. Using a different cloth for wiping hands and things, so you're not using the same cloth to wipe the infant that's just tried the allergen food, and then wash, the cleaning the sibling. So having separate cloths is important. So it's thinking of those types of things. And once we've made a start with introducing an allergen food, the key thing is that we need to make sure we keep exposing our young ones with this allergen food. So we need to make sure that they are having it. The recommendation is trying to keep it in the in part of the food twice a week, so that they keep being exposed to those allergen foods. So
at least twice a
I
week.
know that sometimes whanau can be quite nervous about introducing an allergen food if say sibling that's got they've got a little one that's got an allergy, but it is important that is introduced in those before they're 12 months of age, because then they are less, I'm not saying that they won't, but there is the less likely to develop
Allergies. Yeah. Oh, that's really good practical tips, Helen. Thank you. And what about for those that has already been diagnosed with a food allergy? And usually at what age can they actually diagnose a food allergy, Helen?
So there's I guess there's there is one what we call one type of allergy called it's food protein induced allergic proctocolitis. So a big long word to.
Yes.
But sometimes an infant might have blood in the stools, so the little bit of blood when they poos, or and the poos is all mucousy, and they are being breastfed. It's often young ones that are breastfed, healthy, they're growing well, but they just develop this little bit of blood in the stools. Now, we obviously have to make sure that it's not because of other reasons. It might be, sometimes they might be a little bit constipated. And so, but if there's no other reason, it may be that this cow's milk protein can cause this. And so we do a trial where the breastfeeding mum will take out cow's milk from her diet, and if the infant, the blood disappears, and eventually the mucus as well, then we usually it's recommended to do a retrial, so to put it back in mum's diet, and if the blood comes back again, we think, okay, we better take it out. That's exactly what it is causing this problem. And so the infant, so before they've even started, and this can be as early as about a month of age or younger, but usually around that sort of 3 to 4 weeks, or sometimes a little bit older. And if it's taken out, so mum has, so obviously infant isn't having any foods, they just have, they can continue with breastfeeding, but mum needs to eliminate dairy from her diet.
Okay.
So we have to, it's always a good idea to see a dietitian if that's the situation, because we can advise mum to make sure that she's, getting all the nutrients she needs, particularly calcium, which is what we get a lot of in our dairy products. And so when when that little one, so they will usually continue to need to avoid dairy till around about 9 to 12 months of age. But so the other allergen foods still need to be introduced though. And so still need to trial the egg, still need to trial the peanut, and, the other, the wheat and the other allergen foods, soy and things. So that's one type of allergy that can occur. Another time, sometimes Infants might, maybe some situations where they aren't able, mum's not able to breastfeed for whatever reason, and they're
Mm-hmm.
given an infant formula and they're given cow's milk formula
Mm-hmm.
and react to that maybe with a, rash all over. Or different signs that they've
Mm-hmm.
got an allergy if it's an immediate reaction. Then of course we recommend an alternative formula. If they're less than 6 months of age, then it's one
Mm-hmm.
of our special formulas. If they're
Mm-hmm.
over 6 months of age, then it's usually we recommend something like a soy formula, um,
That's right.
if they can tolerate that. So in those situations, again, often the whānau are quite nervous, but
Mm.
yes, again, they need to keep trialing the allergen foods.
Yeah, yeah, and always discuss this with your GP as well
Mm,
before trying to introduce something else, or before I guess thinking that, oh, my child has got these symptoms that Helen had described. I think my baby's already got an allergy to something. So having a chat with
uh,
with your well child nurses, with your plunket nurse or tamariki ora nurse, or with your GP if you've got any major concerns
mm,
about symptoms that your Pepi or Tamariki might have gotten that you're quite worried or concerned of, hey, Helen, rather
that's
than
correct. Yeah,
jumping into a
definitely.
conclusion, yeah, that they already have got these allergies.
Yeah, one
Yeah.
of the other things I might mention too,
Mm,
we say that we can introduce the other foods, like as many foods as you like on in a day. But with the
mm-hmm,
allergen foods, we usually say just introduce one at a time. So you don't want
mm,
to be introducing one meal, you don't want to be introducing
eggs
well,
and
the same
fish
meal the
together.
day too. Yeah, because if they have got a reaction, you then don't know which one it is. So yeah, one at a
True,
time for those allergen foods, so that you and know whether that has caused a problem or not. The
for
other
sure.
thing is it's quite good to introduce it earlier in the day. So you might put it part of the
Mm,
sort of the maybe the breakfast meal, or the earlier part of the day, so you can then watch throughout the day if they especially in that first if they have a reaction within the first one, sometimes for an allergy it's usually immediate or fairly
mm,
soon after, but can be up to 2 hours.
mm,
So that's why it's quite good to introduce it early, so that if it's at night time, and then they're going to bed,
mm,
you don't
mm.
know. So it's good to have that early time in the day.
That's
And
right. Yeah.
yeah, and some prefer to have someone else there too, if they're
Mm,
especially
mm,
if they've got there's another child that's got an allergy and they're a bit nervous about it, then having someone with them can sometimes just help make them feel a little bit safer. Um,
yeah.
mm,
For sure, for sure. We've also got quite a few questions sometimes that comes through to us, Helen, is what about like, our breastfeeding mamas? Like you've mentioned about the dairy, for example, if, the child's allergic to dairy, sometimes we say that, moms need to be like removing dairy in their diet. What about like other food allergens? Like for example, a mama's wanting to, have something, of course she's not allergic to it, like something like nuts or whatever. Can this type of food that mom's taking, breastfeeding mama's taking, can this type of food be passed through to the breast milk, and babies might ingest and all of a sudden got a reaction to it at some point, or how likely
um,
it is to happen?
yeah, we don't usually see it coming through. I mean, each breastfeeding mum is different as to how much of
Mm,
the allergen food does actually go through into the
mm,
breast milk. But for things like uh, the dairy, like I described earlier, that they
mm,
can react.
mm,
Um, and sometimes soy. But it's not usually until the infant themselves ingests the food that we see the reactions.
Mm,
So
mm,
sometimes in cases, it's an infant may have eczema, and sometimes and it's not the cause of the eczema, but sometimes
mm,
if the infant's being breastfed and the mum has something like the dairy or egg or peanut, and
mm.
they they think that each time they have that, the eczema is a lot worse.
Flaring up.
Um,
Yeah.
and there's a real flare, and they take it out and it becomes better, and they can have it again and it's all flared up. Then in that situation, we sometimes advise that perhaps to trial it's usually in a situation where an infant's got quite severe eczema,
Mm-hmm.
that a very the red all over, and we're trying to, because the main treatment is using the creams and things that are usually
Mm,
prescribed, but sometimes that can be, um, but not always. And so
mm, mm,
it's not just because an infant's got eczema they have to avoid foods. It's only in those very occasional times where it
mm.
might be exacerbating that eczema. Yeah.
Cool, cool. Now, just to check in as well, Helen, do you think we have covered mostly what our viewers are expecting in our topics for today about allergen foods, or is there anything else that we can add regarding the
Um,
topic, do you think?
yeah, I'm just so I guess we've talked about the cross contamination, and we've talked
Mm,
about um, and I guess the it's just trying as much as possible
mm,
if we can get those allergen foods into uh, um, infant's diet before they're 12
mm,
months of age would be
mm.
ideal. And I mean, if it's just over, if they're struggling to get them in within that time frame, but that's what we, depending on
Yeah,
the each individual, but that's what we aim for. And
that's right.
yeah, and I guess and as you say, it just depends on at what stage they are with their eating,
Mm,
as to what form we that we give it. But certainly, we find that I often give the whanau, that website that we talked about, because that's got lots of practical other information and little
good.
videos as well as how to go about it, some
Yeah.
recipes, and lots of good ideas depending on the age of the infant. So yeah, look
Cool.
out for that website.
Perfect, perfect. Thank you. Thank you for all the practical tips and those wealth of information that you've shared with us tonight, Helen. And I think to cover everything, we've covered about the allergen foods, which Helen had discussed with us on the first part of our Facebook live chat. You can backtrack it once this video has been uploaded to our website. We've got it on Facebook and on YouTube as well, so keep an eye on these videos. Um, and we've talked about, of course, with breastfeeding mama as well. We've talked about the F pies, which is a known allergy here in New Zealand. And it might be that there are some whanau tamariki as well that might have got other allergies. Talk to your GP about it. Ring Plunket line if you're concerned that your child might be reacting to something. Our nurses are very helpful in doing health assessments over the phone. We may not be able to, prescribe or give medications, but definitely we will be happy to assess your little wee ones and refer you further if need be. Again, thank you for joining us tonight, Helen. Any other words of wisdom for us tonight?
Um, no, just enjoy those wonderful times with your infant, and yeah, with when they're exploring and they're looking at you to, with how you're eating, and it's a fun time to,
Mhm.
with those days when they're when they're exploring those foods. So yeah,
Lovely.
enjoy. And thank you for having me on the live chat tonight.
Thank you, Helen. Tēnā koe, everyone. You have a lovely evening. Thank you.
All right, thank you.